Hello and welcome to I Know Dino. I'm Garrett.
And I'm Sabrina.
And today in our 462nd episode, I've got an article about a new Hypsilophodon close relative.
And I've got an update on silesaurs.
The maybe dinosaur morphs from the Triassic. We also have an interview with Charles Nye, not to be confused with Charles Knight, but they are both paleo artists.
Charles Nye is a modern paleo artist.
Yes, that's how we interviewed him.
Or how we were able to, yes.
Yeah. And we have dinosaur of the day, Gideonmantellia. Wonder where that name came from. Could it be named after Gideon Mantell?
Could be. I was going to say after someone who is not considered to be modern.
That's true. 19th century, 1800s.
Mm-hmm.
But before we get into all of that, as always, we like to thank some of our patrons. And this week we have a new patron to thank, and that's Travis. Travis recently interviewed me on his podcast, Fossils and Fiction, which is part of a research project about dinosaur podcasters. Like we talked about in an early episode when we said, it'd be interesting if someone wrote a paper about dinosaur podcasts. And then Travis emailed us and was like, I'm doing that paper.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And the podcast at the same time. So yeah, check out Fossils and Fiction if you want to hear that. And then rounding out our shout outs, we've got Bradley, Danny Hermes, Linda, Witch Lars, Brendan and Clarissa, the Howard family, Spinolorus, TRX Dinosaurs, and Sarasaurus Rex.
Yay, Dino-it-alls! Thanks for being part of our community.
Jumping into the news, I've got our new Hypsilophodontid dinosaur. And I feel like Hypsilophodontid should be in quotes because that's a very contentious category.
Mm-hmm. Oh, that's why earlier you said a relative of Hypsilophodon.
Yes. And this paper was written by Nicholas Longrich and others and published in Cretaceous Research. So yeah, Hypsilophodontidae is a contentious category, but they're basically really small ornithopods. You can think of things that look sort of like hadrosaurs, or at the very least, they are neo-ornithischians. Some people don't even think they're within Ornithopoda and just have them basically as general ornithischians. But because the only non-controversial Hypsilophodontid is Hypsilophodon itself, I'm going to start there for this comparison.
Makes sense.
Hypsilophodon was about 1.5 to 1.8 meters or 5 to 6 feet long, and its head would basically reach the knee or a little bit higher on an adult human.
Oh, cute.
Yeah, kind of like a dog. If that sounds small, though, the new dinosaur that I'm going to talk about in a minute is only about 80 centimeters or 2.5 feet long, and its head wouldn't even reach above a pair of rain boots.
Oh, is this a contender for a potential pet dinosaur?
I think, yeah, pretty much all Hypsilophodontids, where they were sort of a wastebasket taxon for pet-like dinosaurs, you could say, because they're all pretty small. They're all mostly considered to be herbivorous, maybe omnivorous. So it's very dog-like if you think about it, like sort of dog-sized, dog-type diet, maybe dog behavior, who knows? Although they were bipedal, so that makes them different than a dog. And they didn't have hair, so they probably wouldn't have been as soft. Maybe they were a little fuzzy. I don't know. Hypsilophodon was probably an herbivore or an omnivore, just like the other Hypsilophodontids, and we think that based on its jaws and its mouth. Most of its teeth are serrated like Iguanodon, and it also has some triangular teeth in the front, which are pretty unusual for an herbivore. Usually don't have the sort of spiky teeth in the front, especially since it has a beak, which would have been useful for chomping through tough vegetation. So it's kind of a strange dinosaur. If you imagine a sort of really tiny bipedal iguanodon with a more triangular, shorter snout, that's sort of on the right track for what Hypsilophodon looked like, if you're not familiar. It's just sort of a general, really small dinosaur. They look kind of like the very earliest dinosaurs too, like even silesaurs that we're going to talk about later, in that they're bipedal and like really slender, except that these are probably herbivorous. So that's a big difference from the early dinosaurs. Hypsilophodontids have been grouped within Iguanodontia on and off since the first time they were described. The first Hypsilophodon was found on the Isle of Wight in 1849.
Ooh, it's an early one.
It was very early, yeah. Both Gideonmantellia and Richard Owen considered it to be Iguanodon. The first illustrated Hypsilophodon was labeled as Iguanodon, and Thomas Henry Huxley was the first one to recognize it as different enough to get its own genus name. So it really had a lot of the big names in early dinosaur science involved with it. You've got Gideonmantellia, Richard Owen, and Thomas Henry Huxley all looking at this dinosaur, studying it. It helps that it was from Britain itself, so it was easily accessible.
Yeah.
When Huxley named it, he wanted it to have a similar name to Iguanodon because of how similar they are. So what he did was he thought, okay, Iguanodon derives from iguana plus tooth in Latin. So Huxley picked the closest living lizard to the iguana, which was called Hypsilophus. So he made it Hypsilophus plus tooth in Latin, which became Hypsilophodon. The funny thing, though, is that Hypsilophus was later synonymized with iguana. So they're both technically named after the iguana, and it's just sort of a different way of saying iguanodon now. It's also similar to how people have lumped most Hypsilophodontids into Iguanodontia, that Hypsilophus got lumped into iguana.
I had the same thought, although I would not have worded it as well as you just did.
It's hard. It's a lot of tongue-twisty long words, so you probably would have been easier to say the way you would word it. Over the years, many more Hypsilophodon individuals have been found on the Isle of Wight, aka Dinosaur Isle, and according to the new paper, Hypsilophodontids are, quote, the most common small dinosaur, end quote there. Until this paper, every Hypsilophodontid from the island has been assigned to Hypsilophodon foxi, but of course, now there's a new one.
Oh, there are enough differences. We have talked about Hypsilophodon before in episode 28 as the dinosaur of the day, but it's been a long time. So it's good that you refreshed my memory, Garrett.
Yeah, I did use your notes a little bit, but then I double-checked other places because it's been a while and things have changed. And basically since then, when a lot of the people were saying Hypsilophodon today isn't a good group to use anymore. So this new dinosaur is named Vectidromaeus insularis. The origin of Vectidromaeus comes from Vectis, which is the Roman name for the Isle of Wight. That's the same root that they used for the ankylosaur Vectipelta that was just named, and Vectoraptor that was named last year. There are also some earlier dinosaurs like Vecterovenator, Vectensia, which is probably Polacanthus, and Vectosaurus, which is now called Mantellosaurus. So it's been going on for a while, the whole Vect and Vecti.
Makes sense.
Yeah, it's pretty cool that it has its own specific Roman name for this island that you can use for dinosaur names. The dromeus part of Vectidromaeus means runner. So you could translate it to the Isle of Wight runner if you want to.
Oh, even though it's so small, it was a runner.
Yes. And then insularis means insular. And presumably that's because it lived on an island, and that's one of the definitions of insular. For Dinosaur Isle fans, it was found at Sudmore Point on the west side of the island. It probably didn't live at the same time as Hypsilophodon.
So that's the first clue.
Yes. Vectidromaeus is about 150 meters deeper in the rock than Hypsilophodon. I didn't translate that to feet, but that's probably about 500 feet deeper. That's an extreme amount of rock between the two.
Yeah.
And it reminds me that in paleontology, sometimes a million years can be like a few inches, and sometimes it's hundreds of feet. Really varies depending on the geology. Vectidromaeus is basically the very beginning of the Wessex Formation, while Hypsilophodon is right at the end. It's hard to know exactly, but the holotype of Vectidromaeus likely lived about 4 million years before Hypsilophodon. They found a lot of the holotype of Vectidromaeus. Basically, it's all from the middle of the back and then heading back towards the tail tip. So there isn't anything from like the arms or head or neck, unfortunately.
That's too bad.
But they do have vertebrae from the back and tail. There are bones from the hips, legs, and feet. as well as some ossified tendons, which are scattered around kind of like pickup sticks, it looks like to me in the fossil. Some of the bone surfaces also look like insects might have fed on the carcass, sort of leaving little traces on the bones themselves. And they can tell that it's a juvenile because of the bone texture, unfused vertebrae, and its tiny size.
Okay, so we don't know its full size.
Not as an adult, no. Fortunately, they have juvenile Hypsilophodon individuals to compare this Vectodromaeus to, and they found a lot of differences, mostly in the hips and femur. For example, the back of the ilium is shorter and deeper than Hypsilophodon, which is a little bit weird because juvenile Hypsilophodon also have a shorter and deeper ilium than the adults do, but not to the same extent the Vectodromaeus does. It's even shorter and deeper than a juvenile Hypsilophodon. Another detail is that the femur has a quote-unquote very large fourth trochanter, aka there's a big bump in the middle of the bone on the femur.
Yeah, that's why you have to know the specific groups of dinosaurs pretty well, or at least have good fossils to compare it to, because it's often these specific details as how you know, oh, this is a new dinosaur.
Yeah, they pretty much always are. I mean, I guess sometimes it's something really obvious. Like if you're looking at ceratopsians, sometimes you just look at the horns and you can tell the difference. But yeah, typically, especially when you're just all you have to work from are some limb bones and hips, you have to find the subtle differences in those places. These aren't even that subtle, though. They're pretty obvious when you look at them, side by side at least. Overall, Vectodromaeus or Vectodromius is very gracile. Even its foot, which must be why they named it for its presumed running abilities, with that dromius meaning running. Although some of that nimbleness may be due to its young age. We're not quite sure. If it grew up, it might not be so much of a dromaeus anymore.
Oh, wasn't as gracile, maybe.
Yeah, might not have been as much of a runner. As the authors put it, quote, Hypsilophodontidae has traditionally been used as a wastebasket taxon, including Hypsilophodon and a range of small to medium-sized basal neornithischians such as Thescelosaurus, Parksosaurus, and Orodromaeus, end quote. With more modern interpretations, Hypsilophodon is basically the only member of Hypsilophodontidae because they've all else been recovered elsewhere in the family tree.
That's a small group.
Yeah. But since Vectodromaeus is so similar to Hypsilophodon, these authors consider Vectodromaeus to be a Hypsilophodontid. In other words, now Hypsilophodontid just means Hypsilophodon plus Vectodromaeus.
Well, at least it's not alone.
Yeah, that's true.
Who knows? Maybe more will be added to the group.
Yeah, these things are moving around a lot, and it's still really unclear where Hypsilophodontids and, you know, the things formerly known as Hypsilophodontids, which are like the small, beaky, herbivorous / omnivorous neornithischians, where they all fit. Sometimes they're in Iguanodontia, sometimes they're outside, sometimes they're not even in Ornithopoda. They can be all over the place. And part of the problem is that a lot of the finds are a little bit incomplete, so it makes it harder to figure out where they fit.
Speaking of things that are hard to figure out where they fit, there's a new group of silesaurs that were found, and this adds to that whole debate about where that group stands. So this was published by Gabriel Mestriner and others in the Journal of Vertebrate Paleontology. And silesaurs, they are important for understanding the origin and evolution of dinosaurs. To quote this paper, quote, Silesauridae is a group of gracile dinosauriforms of 1 to 3 meters in length, with long hind limbs and slender arms, known from the Middle Triassic to the Norian of South and North America, Africa, and Europe, end quote. Now, silesaurs have been proposed to be a sister group to dinosaurs, or nesting within the ornithischian lineage, which would make them dinosaurs, but this is still being debated. This particular group of silesaurs, they found disarticulated silesaur fossils from the Santa Maria Formation in Brazil. It's the same area where the sauropodomorph Saturnalia and a possible theropod was found. There was an assemblage of multiple silesaur individuals, and the fossils include parts of the jaw, legs, rib, shoulder. They're all found close together, so it's thought that they're all from the same type of silesaur, the same type of animal.
Oh, but multiple individuals. That's cool.
Silesaurs are poorly represented in South America, which is, quote, an area that likely played an important role in dinosaurian origins, end quote.
Yeah, a lot of our oldest dinosaur fossils and dinosaur morph fossils come from South America.
Mm-hmm. Now, these individuals, they're thought to be silesaurs because of their leaf-shaped teeth, as well as some small details in the legs and the bone histology. When they did histology, they didn't find any annual lags, lines of arrested growth, while they were growing up, and that's a common feature in silesaurids. There are enough unique features that this probably could be named a new type of silesaur, but the authors decided not to name a new silesaur in this case. They said, quote, we decided for such a conservative approach mainly because of the incompleteness of the specimen composed of disarticulated skeletal parts representing several individuals, end quote.
I see. Yeah, if it's all jumbled together and no one bone is sort of a slam dunk for a new animal, then and you have to combine multiple bones, but you don't even know if they're from the same actual animal, then yeah, it's hard to name.
They're playing it safe.
I appreciate that.
I thought you might. But this is the, quote, second silesaurid record in the Carnian of Brazil and the first based on a significant amount of skeletal parts, end quote. Carnian, that's the late Triassic. That's from about 237 to 227 million years ago.
Basically right at the beginning of dinosaurs.
Mm-hmm. And these silesaurs, they have a combination of dinosauromorph and silesaur features. And based on phylogenetic analysis, it shows evolutionary patterns for both. So it doesn't really clarify the debate on where silesaurs stand, but...
doesn't help at all.
Doesn't hurt.
It could help in the future. A lot of times it's like you have these puzzle pieces and it's like this one didn't really help, but then later on you find another one and you're glad you had those earlier ones because they all sort of combine to fill the picture together.
Exactly. Now, hashtag need more fossils.
Mm-hmm. Especially with silesaurs. I really hope that they do settle out as dinosaurs because
me too.
That would just be fun. And in just a moment, we're going to get on to our interview with Charles Nye, but first we're going to pause for a quick sponsor break. And now on to our interview with Charles Nye. But as always, we have an extended version of this interview for our patrons. So if you are a patron, make sure to check out the full version of this interview in your premium content feed. We are joined this week by Charles Nye, a paleo artist, grad student at Oregon State University, and project lead for the Artemis Paleozoo, an international nonprofit whose team is currently working on an art book depicting the care and preservation of life that time forgot. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, glad to be here. I will share one thing. It's not a real nonprofit. That's just world building. If you look at our social media for Artemis Paleozoo is at Project Paleozoo, and we try to keep all the social posts like in universe. You know what I mean? Like, today is blah blah blah, and you can come here to get face painting at 3:00. Just a disclaimer: we are not a 503c,
but you are
we're
working.
A bunch of friends who are like. Yes.
On the art book.
Yes, the art book is our baby. our 17-person child.
We could just pretend that we were staying in universe for that intro, and we definitely were in on this joke.
Yes. Oh, yes. I'm glad you guys enjoyed your stay. I hope you used your meal vouchers on the house.
Excellent. Yeah, 17 people. That is a big team to be working on one project.
I know. No, I kid. It's been very fun because these are all my friends first and foremost. And we all bring something a little bit different to the table. And also, as a grad student in academic science, I'm on several multi-people projects. And my first publication that I'm on is like over 10 people. So this is just kind of like training wheels for eventually I'll have to lead like a massive thing, I'm sure. But for now, a nice project with some friends and relatively low stakes. We're going to donate all of the profits to charity, that kind of thing. So it's a fun thing.
Nice. And everyone's got different skills they're bringing, right? Because there's probably a number of artists and writers. And
It's been funny to write down like our official credits because it's like artist, zoological consultant, artist. Yeah, so we all bring in something a little different, and like it's really cool because we all have different art styles. Obviously, we have people who do more of like the field guidey, like not photorealistic, but like more towards realism, like myself and some of our other artists. And we also have cartoonists and comic panelists and things like that. So a nice variety of stuff. It's actually really fun because we also share designs too. Like someone will make up the original design for, say, our T-Rex, and then someone else will make like a different piece of the T-Rex interacting with an enrichment item.
Mm.
It's really cool seeing that style and that like the design translated, right,
Yeah.
across different hands. So that's been really cool to see as well. I'm really gassing up this book, but yeah.
Does the different skills make it easier to divvy up the work? Is it like, okay, well, this person is the one that's good at doing sort of the infographic stuff, so they're going to do that piece, and this person is more into like the nitty gritty details of the animals, that might be you doing those? Or do you have to get into like, well, you're going to do the Triceratops and you're going to do the T-Rex and that kind of thing?
Well, this started very informally, actually. It was, oh God, like 2021, 2022, that we were like, this group chat actually started as we wanted to make a little art zine, whatever you want to call it,
Mhm.
of just dinosaur themed stuff. But then we were like, what if we did something collectively for like the same kind of premise? And then Artemis Paleozoo came up. And it was actually initially, okay, I want this species. It was like, that's how we divvied up initially. And then like, we do have people who are designated, writers and designated graphic artists, but like we all have like hands in each other's pots to like help refine and tweak. Right now, I've been doing a lot of work with our graphic art team for the layout of the
Mhm.
book in like Adobe software. That's been really eye-opening, in particular to how books are formatted and like negative space and a lot of conceptual stuff that I wouldn't have been thinking about from the get-go, but it's really important to think about. And there's something called reader's exhaustion. Do you know about that?
No.
Yeah, apparently, there's psychological. There are only so many words you could fit on a line before people start to get fatigued with writing.
Mm.
Like they'll start to skim
Hmm.
after a certain amount of words online. I think it's 7 to 10, depending on the font size. And that's something one of our graphic artists brought up. I'm like, really? That's a thing. And they're like, yeah. And so we've been dancing in circles, pining down writing, refining that and this. So yeah, so it's been a ordered, chaotic, wonderful, fun learning experience for all of us. And I would have never have asked for a better group to work
Yeah.
with, honestly.
Which animals are highlighted? How did you choose which ones to feature?
Oh gosh, it's very dinosaur heavy.
Nice.
That's good.
I think for our first project, we were like, we all like dinosaurs, so let's just do a bunch of dinosaurs. It was difficult balancing the best of all times versus who deserves or who might warrant more of a spotlight, right? Of course, we have Tyrannosaurus. I actually was a champion for vetoing Tyrannosaurus when we were first talking about the book. I was like, what if we just not have T-Rex? And then everyone's like, what are you talking about? That's like if Disney came out with something and didn't include Mickey Mouse. I'm like, yeah, I get it. I wanted Camarillas to be our big theropod, and we do have one too.
Mhm.
So it was a lot of give and take in the what is reasonable for a zoo setting. So we only have one megasauropod, for example, Dreadnoughtus, as opposed to like, like in Jurassic World, there's somehow they have herds of Parasaurolophus and Triceratops and Stegosaurus with Apatosaurus and Brachiosaurus and all these other mega herbivores. And it's like, how is this island not barren by this
Yeah,
point?
it's very lush too.
Right. Yeah, we crunched the numbers on some of our species, and it's like X amount of tonnage per day.
Mhm.
And like realistically, this actually can't work, but we're just going to assume that we have like a contract with like some farm or something. There's a lot of these like detailed in the weeds conversations that we have, which are honestly great brain food for all of us to consider. And it's like, oh, would this get along with that? Something we've been playing with is like, intertemporal species interactions. how would like this species interact with this? Can you house them in the same place?
Mm-hmm.
Because today in zoos, there are some zoo exhibits that have, like Asian and African elephants in the same space. It's not intertemporal. It's not like they're from different times, but they're not from the same continent.
Yeah, they've never seen each other.
But they're similar enough, or at least compatible enough, where like if you house female Asian and African elephants, they'll most likely get along, right?
Yeah.
So that's been very fun to do. But that, I haven't really answered the question. But it's just balancing like, okay, we do need some of the stars, but for example, we don't have Triceratops, we don't have Velociraptor, right? We don't have, I'm trying to think of other Pteranodon's not there too. Right? Or Mosasaurus. We don't have a Mosasaurus. But it's like instead we have Pterodactylus, we have Diabloceratops, and some other cool alternatives. But they're just some that you can't get rid of like T-Rex.
Yeah.
Yep.
And honestly, Stegosaurus too. Stegosaurus was a pretty late addition, if only because it was sort of like we had Miragaia already, and it's like, do we need Stegosaurus? Stegosaurus is pretty impressive.
Yeah.
And so it's like, yeah. And we have the one. His name is Boris.
So they also
that's
all
another
have
thing
names.
too. Most of these have names.
Nice.
A lot of them do.
That's cool. I love all the background, all the detail that you get into when you're planning something like this. And like you were talking about with the amount of food, because it is reasonable to say like, well, zoos bring in a lot of food. But then when you start thinking about the scale of it, it makes you think about like, okay, well, how much money does the zoo need? How does that affect, because like making it just like a simple little zoo that needs like an enormous amount of food is like, oh, that's going to be weird. So we got to make that consistent and everything.
Yeah. And that's why we only have 3 Dreadnoughtus.
Yeah.
We have the 2 adults and the 1 little one. And that even then it's like, oh, is this a sustainable thing? And we have Europasaurus, which is, giraffe size, but still like it's like a small herd of elephants.
Yeah.
And each Dreadnoughtus is a small herd of elephants already by itself. So yeah, that's been fun.
Going back to the animals, it sounds like a lot of the animals in the book are involved in studies too. Like I was going through through the Instagram page and I saw like Deinonychus, and there is part of a study on color recognition or using positive reinforcement to assess the growth of Europasaurus over time. Like really cool details there.
Oh yeah, one of us is a zookeeper, like I mentioned, and I've also worked at the Monterey Bay Aquarium, and so we have people who have like worked alongside endangered or like otherwise exotic species in captivity, and like how are they treated? Like what's the utility besides the ambassador angle, right? Like that's the biggest point of advocacy for zoos is, oh yeah, people are inspired by seeing an elephant up close. But there are other things you can do, right, besides just that direct inspiration. It is, how does an elephant respond to a mirror in front of it? As we know, elephants are, cognizant of their selves. So, like, animals in these settings can teach us a lot about how they act, or how, what their cognitive abilities are, or how easy it is to train them. We have a lot of target training pieces in this book, lots of things on poles, because that's something that basically any animal with eyes can learn, is how to be target trained. At the aquarium, do you guys know of the mola mola, the ocean sunfish?
Yes.
Is that the one that's in the baby whale video?
Yeah, Josh, it's a baby whale. Yes, it is. Those guys are very difficult to train, but you could train something as, limited attention span as that to be target fed. Why not a dinosaur? Right? Like, why not have the T-Rex come over when you hold my hand?
What is target feeding?
So basically, for the concept behind target feeding or target training is to hold out a target, which is some kind of object that will only be used for this training, and have the animal associate that with either a behavior or with food. Basically, hey, come over here. It's like a visual dinner bell, or it's a put your left hand up over here and touch this. That way we can check the underside of your arm, or like check your arthritis or something. We had one of our oldest sea otters I don't work there anymore, but when I was at the aquarium, our oldest sea otters responded to a series of target trained activities to test their arthritis and other age-associated chronic conditions.
Oh, wow.
And so, yeah. A lot of, like I said, a lot of thought has gone into it just because we've seen it with like living animals and how modern exotic animal husbandry goes. We love the Jurassic series because we're all dinosaur nuts, but that's something that we wish we could have seen more of, like in Jurassic World, is like how does this functioning zoo function?
Yeah.
Right? Like how do you get all these animals to cooperate? Because they need a schedule. A lot of animals respond positively to a schedule. Do you like have an indoor holding place and let them all out at like 6 o'clock in the morning? Do you have them just be open range all the time? That's probably what they did. But yeah, those kinds of things, it's like we think about these when we watch the movies or read books about, other books about dinosaur parks or whatever. And we're like, it'd be cool if they explored this. And this is a good book or a good like mind space to be in to explore those ideas. Not all of them make it into the book, but just to have had the forethought of this is how this happens is it's important. There's another project I've been working on, kind of more of like a wildlife sanctuary, like restricted space kind of setting, where like some dinosaurs have prosthetics, right? One's missing an arm, so you give it a little thing to walk around on. Yeah, so it's been taking wildlife and zoo issues and management policies and stuff like that and copying and pasting dinosaurs into that, we hope elucidates kind of the state of these things that happen behind the scenes that most people don't really think about when they go to a zoo or think about wildlife research, right? It's like, oh, that is interesting, but it's true. It's real.
Yeah.
And the only difference is, well, we don't have big dinosaurs anymore to do this on. But
Yeah. You swap out the sauropod for an elephant and everything else basically is the same.
Exactly. Yeah. More or less. I think a sauropod would be more stubborn than an elephant.
Yeah,
but
true.
a way to test that besides there are some things that we leave up to vibes.
Do you have any favorite scenes from the book?
I'm not going to choose any of mine. One of our artists, Mateo, did this really cool spread piece of the Therizinosaurus getting its claws trimmed. Because that's something that you would have to probably do for a Therizinosaurus, is to trim that. So that's my personal favorite, if only because it's so entertaining seeing this large, just the weird looking dinosaur, the Freddy Krueger, looking thing. And like it's getting fed a branch from up high and someone down low, it's clipping his nails, like, just sanding it down, giving a little manicure. It's the juxtaposition that I really love of like, here's the thing. And wait, what are they doing with it? Huh. In zoos, for animals with like sharp things, they'll either file them down or they'll give little caps, like little rubber caps on them. The Point Defiance Zoo in Washington, they have a walrus male that has these like rubber caps on his tusks so he doesn't hurt anyone or himself. We don't have that for any of the animals, but that was a conversation we had. Like, how do you deal with the sharp bits?
Yeah.
Also, we have a litany of baby animal sketches and pieces that I can't wait to share because it's adorable.
Oh, yeah, the
Right?
baby
It's just
ones.
like, oh. Yeah, it's fun. It's real fun.
What about scenes that you worked on?
One of my pieces is, of course, the Dreadnoughtus, and it is being target trained. And in the background, you can see more of the exhibit and like the kind of gondola, like the guest gondola passage thing. You can, like in the San Diego Zoo or somewhere where it's like the tram overhead. So that's one of mine. It's just day in the life kind of things. So I had one of my friends actually pose for me, pretending she was holding a stick. I'm like, okay, thanks, I need that. And she's in the piece as the keeper for the Dreadnoughtus. It's been hard to get a gauge on like how high should you be above the ground when you're doing these kinds of things. And so I gave her like a little like security belt that would fasten somewhere else on the platform. Because if you're at eye level with a sauropod, like that's a 20 to 40 foot drop if something goes wrong. So we're OSHA compliant at the Artemis Paleozoo.
And you got to keep the gondola up really high too, so it doesn't get inadvertently.
Oh yeah, something hits its head, right? Yeah, yeah. Imagine like a sauropod. Whoop. Yeah, that's why the park closed for the first time in 2006. No. Yeah, we had an incident. Sauropod with a concussion.
Did you come up with like accidents that have happened and things like that?
Nah, we haven't done that just because we want to show what happens when interactions with wildlife and animals goes right
Mhm.
as opposed to going wrong. Because we
Yeah,
have so
that's true.
many things showing what happens when things go wrong. But going right, we argue, is equally compelling because it's not people screaming, it is people taking care of things and like owning up to kind of the stewardship. We all share that value that we think that people and humans should, act as stewards for wildlife and conservation. And that's
Yeah.
an important thing to share. Because I feel a lot of the older tropes in dinosaur media are centered around the journey to the center of the earth or the lost world, sort of not colonialist per se, but it's the old fashioned explory danger.
Hmm.
Nature is dangerous and scary and dark, and there are these
Monsters.
horrible things waiting for us. Yeah, right. Monsters are still here, kind of thing.
Will it be called the Artemis Paleozoo?
We think either that or the Artemis Paleozoological Reserve is going to be the two possible titles for the book, but Artemis Paleozoo will be in it, most definitely.
Awesome. Now I know your field is marine biology, but then you also do paleo art, obviously. Do you find there's a lot of overlap between the two?
There's a surprising amount, if only because the cetacean evolutionary tree and fossil record is remarkably well known. There are some blind spots,
Mhm.
like every taxon, but it's remarkable to see the transitional taxa
Hmm.
or groups of whales starting from basically the KPG all the way up till now. I'm a geneticist, so evolutionary biology is intrinsically linked to what we work on, right? So every time there's a revision of phylogeny or taxonomy, we have to reinforce that with multiple points of evidence in anatomical attributes and genetic attributes. So very closely linked.
Well, that's great. You're already, because paleo art, I know you need to do a lot of research in order to have those accurate drawings and everything. So you're
Yeah.
already doing it.
Mhm.
Yeah, you shared that Triceratops drawing or illustration at a recent talk that we saw you present on. And I was so impressed with all the detail you had included in there. You had a feature I'd never seen in a Triceratops drawing. Maybe I just hadn't noticed it. I didn't have the artist explaining it to me in those cases, but
Mhm.
those big, I think you described them as like nipple scales, but they're like big, like half
Yeah.
softball bumps on them. Those are so cool. How did you find out about something like that?
It was just published, actually. This was unpublished data for like the last decade
Oh.
almost. And so if you're like in the circle, you know about it. But if someone made a Triceratops without the nipple scales, it wasn't technically wrong because no one had gone through the scientific like peer review process to like evaluate what these are.
Mhm.
And that's something that's been very interesting to happen over the last several decades at this point, right? With the rise of like the internet and the accessibility of data, scientists are now able to share preliminary findings or like direct observations on social media or like to their peers on email. And lots of things are bubbling, and you can notice when things start to happen. But then there's that scientific break of like, well, I know this exists. I know this is a thing that will eventually be published. But if someone makes a Triceratops without it, well, how are they supposed to know if they're like a scientific illustrator, like not generalist, but like if their client asks an illustrator, like, hey, draw me a Triceratops. Here's all the peer-reviewed literature.
Mhm.
It's not there. So you can't fault them for that, but like, it's fascinating. But yeah, the Triceratops, the nipple scales or the feature scales, as far as we know, ornamentation, maybe armor, maybe. We don't know what they're for. And this is actually really curious because a lot of dinosaurs we've started to notice or find, trace fossils and impressions that show that dinosaurs weren't a flat kind of skin overlay. It's not just a
Mhm.
bunch of little scales or whatever, or even things like Triceratops with obviously the big three horns and all that. There are so many different kinds of scales and body coverings on these things that they would look bizarre.
Yeah.
If you were to like copy and paste one up today, there's a Diplodocus that I know about, a Diplodocid that someone I know had found and described some scale impressions on. And there's like several different kinds of scales on
Mhm.
Diplodocus, all different shapes and patterns and sizes. If you were to put that on the animal, I've never seen someone actually do this on a full adult reconstruction, but I think we're going to start seeing some really weird things that are very much grounded in what we're seeing in the fossil data. It's so interesting to be around and paying attention now.
Yeah, that's a good point that you made about we don't know exactly what they're for yet, because if you're doing art, you don't necessarily have to know exactly the function, and you might be a little bit less sensitive to the peer review process that gets into all those details about like, oh, it's this type of thing for this reason. If you have a fossil and you can see that it looks a certain way, you just want to include that in your art. Somebody else can figure out what it's for.
It's just because the way it is, right?
Yeah.
Like when we draw things in nature now, it's like, sure, there are some obvious attributes of certain species that you want to highlight when you illustrate it, right? Like the wing patterns of a kingfisher or something, right? Like, yes, that is something interesting and behaviorally and ecologically relevant. I don't know, the warts on a warthog, or like, you know, the bristles of tufts of wiry hair on an elephant tail. You could highlight that, but when you're drawing one, like it's just something that is on the animal.
Mm-hmm.
But you hyperfixate on these things in paleo art because it's like you're making the conscious decision to include them based on like, oh, you know, feathers on T-Rex, for example. We don't know if it had feathers or not, but it's like it's a visual hypothesis that you're putting forward. Like, I agree with this line of evidence and not this line of evidence, and I'm showing you this because this is how mine looks like. But a black bear has black fur, right? And contemporary art, contemporary species, like that kind of thing is, I think, kind of glossed over real easily. And I've not made fun of, but like my friends and I and I have other colleagues who are more contemporary species illustrators. I poke fun at them like, you have it easy.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's so much easier. You know, you take a picture of something and that's the color. That's it. No more questions, huh?
Do they ever say like, well,
But
you
yeah.
have it easy because there's no picture to compare it to?
Yeah, and I'm like, that's not the easy part. That's worse, right? You do know how that's worse.
Are there any other projects or research or things that you're working on that you want to share with our listeners?
I'm working on my first author publication right now, involving a killer whale carcass that we didn't find, but we were able to get DNA from. How did that happen? Wait for the paper to come out. And if I want to highlight that, if only because it was so cool. I basically conceived this method and this project, not on a whim, but more like on a, well, we still have a loose end here. I want to try out this to see if we could find something about this killer whale. And it worked, surprisingly. And also, killer whales are kind of the T-Rex of the cetacean world, if I may, because of the predatory prowess and how much is known about them, and they're so charismatic and striking, and how that hasn't really changed since their rise to fame in the 1960s with the first killer whales in captivity. Just like how T-Rex has never really gone away from the cultural eye since the early 1900s. So, and very similarly, people are pretty touchy about how you interpret killer whale behavior or genetics, or whether you call them killer whales or orcas, right? It's like do you put the hyphen or the dot for T-Rex? One of them is right, but one of them is like how English moves on. And so it's a very similar animal in that regard. But to have this be my first author paper, this subject, it's like having T-Rex be your first author paper as a paleontology PhD student. You're like, well, I kind of did it, huh?
Well, congratulations.
Thank you. It is currently in some internal review, and then it'll go on to peer review, hopefully within the next while. But you know how this stuff goes. Hopefully before the end of the year, we'll have a nice squeaky paper to show for it.
Nice.
So keep an eye out for that. Other things that I'm working on. I'm on other podcasts. If you want to hear more about my whale research, just look up me, Charles Nye, whales podcast. Some key terms will show up. It's a shame because I don't remember a whole lot of the titles of the episodes I'm on, but some podcasts from Marine Mammal Science. I've been on Beyond Blathers and some other things here and there.
Do you have any other social media that you want to share?
Oh, yes. My main account, my main art account is at the Paint Paddock. You can find me on Instagram, on Twitter/X. We're making a transition to another platform with a bluer sky, but I need to get that sorted soon. Also have a website, thepaintpaddock.wordpress.com, and Artemis Paleozoo's socials are at Project Paleozoo on Twitter/X and Instagram, and we're working on more platforms to share on too. And beyond that, yeah, just keep a close pulse on those socials for any cool projects and happenings that will be going on. We have some really cool social media art for Artemis Paleozoo that's always kind of coming out. And we'll have a release date for the book hopefully soon. But yeah, that's where you can find me.
Yeah, all exciting things.
Awesome.
Well, thank you so much for chatting with us today.
Thank you for having me. The I Know Dino kept me company during my darkest of times in undergrad when I was studying and working long hours, just hearing the comforting sounds of dinosaur recaps in biology is a nice anchor away from the more monotonous parts of that experience.
Thank you so much, Charles. It was so much fun hearing about the Artemis Paleozoo. Looking forward to seeing it when it comes out. And before we get into our dinosaur of the day, we're going to pause for a quick break from our sponsors. And now on to our dinosaur of the day, Gideonmantellia, which was a request from Tyrant King via our Patreon and Discord, so thanks. Gideonmantellia was a basal ornithopod that lived in the early Cretaceous in what is now Teruel, Spain, in the Camarillas Formation. It looked somewhat similar to Hypsilophodon.
What do you know?
We've got a theme going. It was small and slender. It had a long tail, short arms. It walked on two legs and a somewhat long skull with a beak. The holotype skeleton is estimated to be about 3.2 feet or 1 meters long. The holotype, though, is a partial articulated skeleton, no skull, of a juvenile.
So it's a big old question mark of how big it would be.
Yes.
Just like Vectodromaeus.
Exactly. It's all connecting. Well, they think it's an immature individual because there were unfused bones, and some of the lack of fusion means that the animal was still young when it died. There's no histology done, so it's hard to know exactly how old it was.
Also like Vectodromaeus.
Yeah. The holotype includes 21 tail vertebrae and other vertebrae, parts of the ribs, parts of ossified tendons, parts of the pelvis, both legs, and a lot of the feet. In the paper describing it, they say, quote, both femora are almost completely preserved, especially the left one.
They're both really good, especially one of them is even more really good.
Yes. Also, quote, altogether, 104 remains from the vertebral series, left hip, and the two hind limbs have been identified, all belonging to a single individual. This makes it the most complete ornithopod skeleton and one of the most complete dinosaur skeletons found in Spain. And
nice.
Yeah.
Over 100 bones is a good milestone to reach.
Oh, yeah. Jose Maria Herrero Marzo and his son found the fossils in 1982. First, it was thought to be a CF Valdosaurus SP. So that's very, very uncertain Valdosaurus. Because this is all based on a femur, and Valdosaurus is an iguanodont. In 1987, Jose Luis Sanz and others described the left femur and ilium, the leg and part of the pelvis, and referred it to Hypsilophodon foxi, speaking of that wastebasket taxon. In 1994 and 1995, Jose Ignacio Ruiz Omeñaca realized that it was a new dinosaur after further preparing the bones, and he wrote about it in his thesis and then published more details and descriptions over the years. And it's the details in the pelvis and tail that made it unique. In 2006, he named the dinosaur Gideonmantellia amosenwane in his doctoral thesis, but the name wasn't yet valid. It was a nomen ex dissertatione.
Haven't heard that one before.
Me either. It's a fun one.
So it's a name without a dissertation, or I guess without a...
I think it's because being published in a thesis isn't the official route to naming a dinosaur or to naming a species. But it was officially named Gideonmantellia in 2012 by Ruiz Omañaca and others. And the type species, and the only species, is Gideonmantellia amosenwane. The genus name, as you probably guessed, you did guess, Garrett, earlier in the show, is in honor of Gideon Mantell.
Yeah.
Mantell was the, quote, first author to describe and to figure Hypsilophodontid, that's in quotes, remains in 1849 as those of a very young iguanodon, end quote, which later became the paratype of Hypsilophodon. So just building on what you were saying earlier.
Mm-hmm.
Mantell discovered dinosaurs, including Iguanodon, Hylaeosaurus, Pelorosaurus, and Regnosaurus.
At least he named them.
Yes, and the species name, amosenwane, is in honor of Olga Maria Amosenwan, quote, who was doing her thesis on eggshell fragments of vertebrates from the lower Cretaceous of Galve when she died prematurely in October 2002, end quote.
Well, that's sad.
It is.
But it's nice that they honored her with a dinosaur name.
Yes.
I had assumed that the San Juan part would have been one of the many, many cities named San Juan, not a person named San Juan.
Yeah, surprise. And Galve is a village in the Teruel province in Spain, and it's known for the latest Jurassic Early Cretaceous vertebrate fossils. There's more than 50 localities with fossils from dinosaurs, pterosaurs, sharks, amphibians, fish, turtles, crocodilians, mammals, and squamates.
It's definitely one of the spots on the Iberian Peninsula that we talk about the most.
Mm-hmm. And in the same place where Gideonmantellia was found, they also found parts of the feet of a medium-sized theropod and fossils from bony fish, turtles, and crocodiles. Unfortunately, the locality where these fossils were found was, quote, destroyed by the local clay mining industry.
Oh, bummer.
Yeah. But they do note that after the Gideonmantellia specimen died, its skeleton moved a short distance and was buried quickly. There were no real signs of abrasion or weathering.
But a little bit of signs of it, it sounds like. They know it moved.
Yes.
Or maybe they're just scattered a little bit.
But not bad. Now, other dinosaurs that lived around the same time and place as Gideonmantellia included the Spinosaur, Camarillas, Iguanodon, and a lot of indeterminate dinosaurs, including sauropods, dromaeosaurs, and allosaurs. And other animals that were around there, too, at the same time, included turtles, snakes, crocodiliforms, pterosaurs, fish, and mammals. The holotype of Gideonmantellia is on display in a local exhibition under municipal management in Galve, Spain. At least I'm pretty sure it's still there, from what I could tell when I was researching it, that it seems to be the spot it's in.
Cool.
And our fun fact for today. Yeah, I did the fun fact for this episode. Thought it would be fun since we interviewed Charles Nye to have a fun fact about Charles Knight.
Good idea.
Charles Knight, we know, pioneered paleoart and shaped a lot of what it is today, and really paid attention to details in anatomy and based his paintings on real fossils, including for the now dubious Agathalmus, that's ceratopsian.
That shows up from his 1800s version in stuff going all the way into like the 1960s.
Yeah. That's how influential he is.
Yep.
Tyler Greenfield published about this in Prehistoric Magazine recently, and it's a really cool in-depth look here. So I'm going to kind of summarize. Charles Knight painted Agathalmus in 1897, and he did the blues and the greens and the browns.
It's kind of like a turquoise color almost.
Mm-hmm. It's very pretty. As Tyler put it, it, quote, strikes a regal pose, decked out in a suit of armor plating and brimming with horns and spikes, end quote.
It's like the most bristly looking dinosaur I think I've ever seen depicted, because its body is just like covered in spikes, almost like a porcupine level of spikes.
Yeah, I guess that's one way of thinking about it.
I guess they're mostly sort of down the midline of its body. So maybe more like an iguana with like the spikes going down the back.
Oh, okay.
But then they also gave it like osteoderm sort of on the sides. And then it's got a crazy number of spikes for like the epiossifications around the edge of the frill.
Yeah.
Because it's sort of like a triceratops looking ceratopsian.
I mean, you're pointing out all these things that it's really cool. Charles Knight based these all on real fossils that at the time were attributed to this dinosaur that is now
Agathalamus.
dubious. Yeah.
That you've never maybe heard of because nobody talks about it because it's not really a dinosaur anymore.
Well, it was also one of the first dinosaurs that Charles Knight painted. And it's so influential, as Tyler put it, it was, quote, copied by other artists to the point where it became a paleo art meme.
A meme before the memes were memes.
Yes, exactly. And there's identical designs in trading cards, newspapers, magazines, scientific papers, and you also see it in the stop motion model in The Lost World, the 1925 silent movie.
I can't remember which one it is, if it's like 1 million years BC or something in like the 1960s.
Oh, okay.
I saw it and I was like, what is Agathalamus doing in this?
Being cool.
Whoever researched that movie was like, I like this dinosaur. We're going to stick it in there without realizing. Well, I mean, I guess they had cavemen with it, so they weren't doing the most realistic take anyway.
No. Anyway, Charles Knight was commissioned to paint Agathalamus in 1897 for a magazine article written by William Ballou. Ballou, if his name sounds at all familiar from maybe our Bone Wars episode, he was on Edward Cope's side in the Bone Wars. And Cope was doing consulting for the article and the art. So Charles Knight worked with Cope for 2 weeks at Cope's house, and he sculpted wax maquettes of each dinosaur to better see their anatomy, and used Cope's sketches to help with his drawings. Cope died a few weeks later, so he didn't see the paintings. But this whole experience made Knight a better paleo artist and made him appreciate fossils more. Now, like we've been saying, Agathalamus is a dubious dinosaur now, but at the time, it wasn't. And Charles Knight was basing his painting on real fossils. And the holotype included vertebrae and hips from the Lance Formation of Wyoming. There was no skull, but Agathalamus is probably a synonym of Triceratops or Torosaurus.
Yeah, you can't really tell from the bones they had what dinosaur it was, which is why it's dubious.
Yes.
But there was enough to tell it was a ceratopsian. And they knew what ceratopsians roughly looked like at the time, which is why it looks like a extra spiky ceratopsian in the paleo art.
So the horns for the Agathalamus painting came from fossils that Cope and Charles Sternberg found in Montana in 1876 in the Judith River Formation. And the nasal horn is based on the holotype of Monoclonius that Cope named in 1889, and it's similar to Centrosaurus. Charles Knight based the rest of the skull and body on Marsh's skeletal restoration of 2 Triceratops specimens from the Lance Formation. Dun dun dun, he used the rival. That includes the osteoderms that he painted on the Agathalamus. So he was basing this on real fossils that were misidentified as ceratopsid osteoderms.
Oh, okay, that makes sense.
Based on these 4 elements that Marsh had illustrated and referred to as Triceratops in a paper in 1891. There's no information about where they were discovered. It's probable that John Bell Hatcher found them, though, when he was collecting Triceratops skulls between 1889 and 1891. So the osteoderms probably came from the Lance Formation. The osteoderms have since been studied, and turns out they were from different dinosaurs. One was a neck spine from what's now known to be Denversaurus.
Oh, an ankylosaur.
Yep. So that's how you get the spikiness on this Agathalamus. The second and third ones are from some type of ankylosaur. One's a scute that could be from that bony half ring around the neck. The smaller one would have fit in between other scutes, and that could be from Denversaurus or Ankylosaurus. And the last one came from Stygimoloch, now known as a juvenile Pachycephalosaurus. That's the part of the horn on the back of the head.
Oh, wow. So they really had a smattering of spikes from all sorts of different dinosaurs.
Yeah. That could be why it looks extra spiky. So the Agathalamus spikes look like the Pachycephalosaurus horn. It even has the little knobs around them. The scutes on the side are the ankylosaurs. They're large, rectangular on top, and small and rounder below. And then the spines on the frill are like the Denversaurus spine. And Knight probably thought it was a bone on the edge of the frill. Now, even though Agathalamus was one of the first dinosaurs that Knight painted, it wasn't the first armored ceratopsid illustrated. Joseph Smith drew a Triceratops for the 1892 book Extinct Monsters, and he based it on Marsh's skeletals. In the book, it also has Marsh's horn figure, which that helps to show that Smith used Marsh's work for reference, or to base his Triceratops on. And that also means that Knight probably knew about Marsh's thoughts on these osteoderms, though it's unclear if Knight was influenced by Joseph Smith or if he just decided to do the osteoderms on his own.
There's also this Cope sketch from 1890, which is one of the funniest drawings I've ever seen of a dinosaur, which is an agathalamus, and it's I don't even know how to describe it. It's sort of like shrink wrapped combined with like goofy big nose.
Oh, yes, it looks kind of like how I was drawing dinosaurs when I was first drawing dinosaurs.
Yeah, like a 5-year-old drew it is what you mean. It's pretty hilarious. I'll put it in our Discord because it's worth seeing, but I love that that was just like 7 years before Knight made this like really beautiful, highly detailed version. There's like this scribbling on a napkin looking thing.
It's a sketch, it's a placeholder.
Yeah. But it's been preserved forever through the internet.
Yep. And, well, it was preserved before the internet. Well, anyway, Charles Knight had a big impact on paleontology and pop culture. And as Tyler wrote, quote, his agathalamus is no exception, even though today it is usually seen as a relic of a bygone era. In reality, it represents a turning point in paleoart history when anatomy began to be seriously studied, end quote. Turning point in that, like, dinosaurs weren't seen so much as monsters, but as real animals. And Knight, quote, pioneered the practice of filling in fragmentary species with remains from more complete relatives, which is still essential in modern paleoart, end quote. And just to wrap up this whole thought, Tyler wrote, quote, the agathalamus is the epitome of what made Knight's dinosaur so believable and memorable, his attention to anatomical detail, end quote. So yes, agathalamus is dubious, and when we look at it today, we're like, how did that happen? But at the time, he was basing it on what the research was telling him.
Yeah. When I think of Charles Knight, I always think of Leaping Laelaps, which was also drawn in 1897 and is, to me, one of the most ahead of its time pieces of paleoart ever, because it's like
dinosaurs in action.
Yeah, and there's literally a predator jumping onto another predator, which is something you expect to see like 100 years later. It looks like a piece of almost like Jurassic Park art, but it was so ahead of its time. It's crazy. It's just too bad that more people latched onto the agathalamus style than the Leaping Laelaps energy.
But nowadays, it's more of the Leaping Laelaps kind of energy.
Yeah, but I mean, for all those years, like Lost World and everything, where they're sort of like lumbering around and
being all spiky.
Mm-hmm.
It did look cool.
Yeah.
And that wraps up this episode of I Know Dino. Thank you for listening. If you enjoy listening to I Know Dino, then please consider leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to this podcast. And if you want to learn more about Vectipelta and the Isle of Wight, check out our episode 451. Stay tuned. Also, next week, we will be talking about another new dinosaur. Thanks again, and until next time.